My name is Yassine Altik. I am one of the marshals for the class of 2016, and I have the honor of introducing Professor Annette Gordon-Reed to all of you before she gives us her last lecture. Annette Gordon-Reed is the Carol K. Pforzheimer Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She's also the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School and a Professor of History at Harvard University. She received the 2009 Pulitzer Prize in History for the Hemmingses of Monticello, an American Family. She's also a recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship, National Organization for Women in New York City's Women of Power and Influence. Whoa, that's big. She was also elected as a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2011 and is a member of the Academy's Commission on the Humanities and Social Sciences. She has been said by so many of her students to be a powerful mentor and an inspiration, and it is with great pleasure that I give you all Annette Gordon-Reed. I never thought I'd introduce a Pulitzer Prize winner before, but here we are, Professor Gordon-Reed. You have that.
Okay. Okay. I have to turn it on, and then I'll be set. I'm set now, right? It's very happy. I feel very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. When I got the invitation, I hesitated a bit because it reminded me of a commencement speech, the possibility of being a commencement speaker, and I've done that twice, and I've been asked since then, and I've declined to do it because I don't like the responsibility of saying something profound on so important an occasion, people sitting there in their caps and gowns with their families and so forth, and I'm supposed to come up with something that they're going to remember the rest of their lives, and it's too much pressure for me, so I don't say yes to those things. But I said yes to this. This is a lunchtime talk. We're not in our caps and gowns, and it's a bit more informal, and therefore I thought it would be something that I was eager to do. Also thinking that it's not like a commencement speech, because it's not supposed to be like the last lecture that you guys hear from your professors. It's supposed to be the last lecture that the person gives, which, if you think about it, as the website says, is a little bit morbid in a way. The last speech, the last lecture. And in keeping with that, when I was thinking about what I was going to say, my life flashed before me, and I decided that I wanted to talk a little bit about my journey to this particular place, and as an explanation that I might be giving to people if it were in fact my last lecture, and I would tell people a little bit about myself and what I tried to be about in my life. And I would have to start, of course, with my parents, who put me on the road to wherever it is that I'm going, where I've been, all the good parts of it, I should say at least, by teaching me or making me believe that I was a privileged person, that we were a privileged family. Now, I know privilege has a connotation and a denotation these days that's not very pleasant. It's meant to suggest cluelessness, right? That the person doesn't understand the benefits, understand the power that they have. Their message was that the privileges that we had created a duty in us to want to try to use our good fortune to sort of move the world forward, to move it along in a way, and try to find the best way for us to do that, and to also think about people who were less fortunate. Now, the other thing I have to say about the privilege is not material privilege. We were not a wealthy family. I grew up in a small town in East Texas. We would be considered middle-class African-American people, but if you were to look at the entire community, we would probably be considered lower middle-class people. My mother was an English teacher. My father was sort of a would-be businessman. He had grocery stores, but he used to give food to people who didn't have money, so you can see what happened with that. He was a failed businessman who kept trying various things, but was a little bit too soft-hearted for that role, to be able to play that role. But we were well-off people compared to many of the people that were in my community. My parents also were different in that both of them had had experiences that a lot of people, the kind of people that they grew up with, didn't have. My father didn't go to college. His mother died when he was 11, and his father became an invalid not long after that, and he had to take care of the family. So he actually went into the Army after high school so that he could take care of his sisters, who were still teenagers. So he didn't get a chance to do that. My mother went away to Spelman College in Atlanta, which was sort of a big deal for a person from Texas, in a small town in Texas. It was sort of out of the ordinary. And so both of them, even though they were not wealthy, they were privileged in the sense that they had had experiences that told them that there was a lot more out there in the world, and there were lots of things that they could do in the world other than in the places where they were settled. They decided to stay in Texas because their family was there, and that definitely limited their options, but that's where they chose to raise their family. So fast forward, 2 older brothers and me. It's 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education, and our county, our school district and our county are resisting desegregation and coming up with all kinds of plans to avoid it. And they came up with something called the Freedom of Choice Plan, which they thought was going to be legal and constitutional, would pass muster. And of course, all the white parents would pick the quote-unquote white school for their kid, and the black parents would pick the black school. My parents decided to defy that expectation and sent me to the white school. And knowing, sort of watching the legal case, seeing how things were progressing, that eventually the Freedom of Choice Plan was not going to pass muster and it would be struck down. And indeed it was. And I was there at Anderson Elementary School by myself. Talk about hostile environments. I was 6 years old, and it was a difficult time. But at that moment, this was an early sort of introduction to the idea that law mattered. Now, I didn't think about law. I didn't know what, I mean, I knew that laws were rules, and that if you broke them, you went to jail. I had a sort of an amorphous sense of what law was, but it was something that my parents talked about. It was something that I knew had operation in my life as a 6-year-old, that before we were restricted to one type of school, then we could go to others. When I went to the movies, we had to sit in the balcony. When I went to the doctor, we sat in a separate waiting room. And I remember sort of looking through the glass windows to the other side and seeing magazines. And they intrigued me, that this is sort of a peering into a different world that was on the other side. And I knew that law sort of came along and eventually changed all of that. Laws put this in place, but lawyers working in another way could change that. And they transformed my community and my parents' lives. They thought that from the little that they had to do, way that they could change the world, that they could do it by not going along with what the plan had been, that whites would go to school with whites and blacks would go to school with blacks. And so, as I said, this introduced me to law as a powerful force. I can't say that I decided, and then and there I decided I was going to grow up and become a lawyer. No, I was a 6-year-old. That was not my sense of what I was supposed to do with the sort of enlarged view of the world that my parents introduced me to and told me to think in those terms. But I did have another thing that I wanted to do, even at that age, was to write. I've always loved to write, and I've always thought of myself primarily as a writer, that is my central identity. And I knew that whatever I did in the world would involve that would be something that was important to me. The other thing that I discovered at Anderson Elementary School was history, a love of history, reading about people in the past really interested me. And the first person who interested me was Jefferson. I read a child's biography of him, and that was my introduction to not only the founding era, but slavery, the institution of slavery. And I began to think about that in ways, this is, I'm 7, 8, 9 at this point. Living in Texas, I understood that slavery existed just from, my great-grandmother was alive until I was 10. Her mother had been an enslaved person until she was about 12 years old. So this was something that was close to me, that I understood it existed. But from reading this book, it sort of opened up a lot of interest to me. And who knows why? People ask me, what was it about that particular book? And I'm sure you've had things like that happen in your life. That something just hits you and you just say, you're interested in it, music, whatever. And that stuck with me. When I was 12, I spent a summer at my grandmother's house, and my mother was with me, and she brought along a book called White Over Black by a historian named Winthrop Jordan. And it was about the development of race in America, from slavery all the way up, and it goes up into the 19th century, and it's one of the most important historical books ever written. And in it, he talks about the development of law, the laws of slavery. And I could see from that racism, the kinds of things that I understood, the reasons that people call people names, the reason that we had been separated out, all those kinds of things were not just embedded in the laws of Jim Crow, they were embedded in the laws of slavery. I thought about slavery basically as holding people, hostage in a way. But I discovered that there was a whole system behind this, statutes. He goes through and talks about it as an unthinking decision, the decision to start slavery in Virginia. Virginia, the largest state, the one that had the most populous, the richest, and the largest number of slaves at this time. And so it's a place to focus on. That it was an unthinking decision. He came to regret that, using that term, because it made it look like they just kind of wandered into it, when in fact what it meant was they did not start with the statute. They did not start with the code immediately for the slave system, that it started gradually. And you can see slaves and people who ran away together, whites and blacks, indentured servants who ran away together, punished differently. There were things that you could do to black people that you couldn't do to white people. Prohibitions against marriage, intermarriage, the notion that baptizing a slave did not make the enslaved person free. All of those kinds of inchoate things that they're putting together, ad hoc things, I should say, until you get a slave code in 1705. And so that made me think about history, the history that was behind race, the racial problems that I was seeing in my hometown, the way my life had progressed, going from a segregated school to an integrated school. All of it started to come together for me. And did I think of becoming a historian at that point? No. I was still fixated on being a writer. When I said a writer, I mean like a novelist, a great American novel. Go to New York and become famous and write the great American novel. I still want to do that. I'm in New York, and I'm working on the great American novel. But that was my idea of, you could change the world with a novel. Now I didn't know that rarely happens, but I sort of thought that, wasn't thinking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, but I was reading a lot of James Baldwin, and he was talking about the civil rights movement, and he was talking about racism in America, and all those kinds of things, and I said, I want to be like that. And a novelist or a journalist, someone writing, I knew writing would be at the core of it. I didn't begin to think about law school until I started to think about college. And it was my father who sort of put it in my head that law might be something to do, that if you want to make a difference in the world, remember desegregation. At the time, this is a time when there were the sort of fashionable sort of leftist lawyers like William Kunstler and all these various people who were out there, lawyers as revolutionaries, which is a problematic concept, but people who saw themselves in that fashion. So he thought, well, this is a way to make a difference. And I was trying to be pragmatic at the time, and I said, well, maybe I should think about going to law school. And here, this is on tape, I will admit that I thought about coming to Harvard Law School. And I made my decision about whether or not to apply to Harvard College, thinking that I don't want to be in the same place for 7 years. Now, I'm 17 years old at this point, right? And I'm sitting down there thinking, all right, I'm going to go to Dartmouth first, and then, which is more like a college. It's not a university. It focuses on undergrads. And then I will go to Harvard Law School. And so that was the plan. And, it worked out. It worked. But that's the way I was thinking. So at this point, I'm still thinking that, maybe I could do this and be a writer on the side or whatever. I had no idea about it. Go to college, major in history. I am told at the time that there's not a lot of jobs for history majors. But what they didn't tell me was that there are many, many jobs for black PhDs, many, many jobs for black PhDs, because there aren't any. I mean, for all intents and purposes, there's a tiny, tiny number of black PhDs, and that's still the problem now. There's such a turmoil in colleges about having more blacks as professors, but most blacks who do really, many blacks who do really, really well in school go to law school, or they go to medical school. And, you know, the prospect of spending another 7 or 8 years and then becoming a professor and not making as much money as one could make as a lawyer, it doesn't seem very attractive to a lot of people. So I didn't realize that I was not in the same pool as everybody else because there were so few blacks going to get a PhD. But I decided to follow what I had originally thought about, was to come to Harvard Law School and try to make my way as, you know, as I said, to try to change things, to sort of change the world, as many people think that when they come to law school. And I got here, and that's not the trajectory that I immediately took. I started hearing about people going on interviews, and I started looking at books that had salaries that were sort of way out of proportion of what anybody in my family would have made. And I started to think, you know, is it really practical for me to give that up for this thing that I thought, you know, that I wanted to do, become a writer, to do all of this, and write the things that I wanted to write. And then I sort of consoled myself by saying, well, I can do both. And so then I go to Cahill, Gordon, and Rindell on Wall Street. That's a lot of work. There's no time to write a novel. There's no time to do anything else but what you're supposed to be doing there as an attorney. And obviously that makes sense. You're billing hours. That's what you're supposed to be there for. And so I was there a couple of years, not, you know, doing something that I did not really want to do. It wasn't suited to me. It's not why I went to law school. I followed other people to this place, which is, you know, I'm grateful for the experience. I learned how to work hard. I got to know Loretta Lynch. Well, I mean, I knew Loretta in the law school, but we were associates together, and there with another woman named Elisa Wallach. We were 3 African-American women there, and we called ourselves the triplets because nobody could ever tell us apart. We'd order food, even though we looked different. I mean, Elisa looks different than the two of us. I mean, Loretta and I, you might be able to, but Lisa, not at all. But we would order food, and people, Chinese food or whatever, and, you know, from the takeout place, and people would bring it to the wrong person. Or I remember being in the elevator one time, speaking with a partner who started talking to me about a case, and I looked at him like, well, what are you talking? And it dawned on me, he thought I was Loretta, and that I was not. And so things like that were, you know, not the kinds of things that make you think that this is the place that I was going to stay, even though people were wonderful to me there, gave me great assignments, and I think had high hopes for me, but this isn't what I wanted to do. And one of the things that you really, really must find in your life is the thing that you really, really want to do, that you can do well enough so that it's not even like work to you. And that's the way I feel now when I'm researching and writing. It doesn't really seem like work to me. It seems like fun, and except for footnotes. Footnotes are problematic because I don't do them when you're going along. That's another tip. Always do the footnotes as you're going along. Don't wait till it's over, because then it's a complete hassle. But so I was there trying to write, trying to do various things. I took a writing class at Columbia. I tried to publish. I published in book reviews in a publication called In These Times, which is a sort of, it's like The Nation, except it's more nation-y than The Nation. Less well-known. Didn't have very much money, but they published me. And so I stuck writing with them. And then I said that this is really, really not sufficient to me. I've got to do something. But the real kicker for me was I woke up one morning and I picked up the New York Times, and I saw an op-ed by a person with whom I had gone to school, college. And I know envy is one of the 7 deadly sins, but it can also be a great catalyst for you, because I had been sort of circling around all the time thinking, you know, do I do this? Do I do that? That was like, if this person can be in the New York Times writing, and he leaves a lot to be desired. I could do this. I could definitely do this, and I should do this, and I should not, waste my time. There are other people who are more talented, other people who love. My husband is a lawyer as well. We met here, and he's a judge now, but he loved being a lawyer. He loved me, protecting the person and doing the deposition and making the person cry on the other side. I mean, he liked all that kind of stuff. That was not for me. That's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to write. I wanted to research. I wanted to enter the lives of other people, but to do it in the way that I wanted to do it. And so I left. I left Cahill for a time. I was general counsel to a small city agency, the Board of Correction, that oversees the running of the New York City jails. I was out on Rikers Island a lot. And it's not a prisoners' rights agency, but the idea was to foster minimum standards and to make sure people weren't put in the stock or mistreated or whatever. But we were given all this responsibility and a tiny amount of money to do it. And it was just frustrating. I mean, Rikers Island is a world unto its own out there. And I just remember going out sometime and seeing all the murals on the walls that the inmates had drawn, just in remarkable talent. I remember going and hearing one time a choir. They had at the women's house, they had a choir. And I was just there, and I just remember I had to leave, just crying, because I thought, what a waste. These are people who are talented, these are human beings, and things have gone wrong in their lives, and many of them probably never had a chance. But there's all of that, and there's a poem, all of that beauty in this place that most people in the United States, not in New York City, knew nothing about. It was just overwhelming. I did the best that I could do, and that's one of the things that happens with these kinds of things. I went in, happy that I was going to be able to make a difference, but it was just too much. It did give me an opportunity to do more writing, however, because it was not the schedule that was at Cahill. And finally, I decided to go into academia, that was the only shot that I had to be able to write, be able to think about issues, to be able to use all of the things that I had been thinking about up until this moment, researching, writing, thinking about society, writing about society in a way that I thought would be useful. While there, I was working interminably, it seemed interminable, on an article about prisons. And I read an article about a movie that was going to be made, a movie called Jefferson in Paris. I don't know, maybe 5 people saw it. It was a horrible movie. It was not a very good movie. And people started saying, this is a story about Jefferson as an ambassador in Paris, or actually I should minister to France, and it tells the story of his relationship with Sally Hemings. And it treats the story as true. And so all of these people were writing and saying, there's no evidence that this ever happened. This is ridiculous. This is a terrible thing that they're going to make this movie. And because I had had this interest in Jefferson before in Monticello, and I knew all about this, I had read all about this particular story, I knew that there was evidence that this story was true. I also knew that when they invoked the words of law, they used law. This was an interesting thing, to use law in history to try to debunk the story, talking about burden of proof, if this were a trial, and talking about witnesses, all the kinds of things that you would recognize, the language that they would use. But they didn't seem to know what they were talking about. And so, when they said, if this were in a court of law, if there were lawyers looking at this, this is how they would resolve it. I said, well, I'm a lawyer, and I know about this topic, so let's play this game. Now, I should say, I was not interested in proving that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings had a relationship that's pretty banal, that happened in slavery all the time. What interested me was how law and how white supremacy was used in history to deal with this topic, to debunk this story, namely the rules in slavery, during slavery time, that said that black people could not testify. Slaves could not testify against white people. Slaves could testify against one another. I mean, they could testify against free blacks, I should say, because nobody cared about free blacks. They could not testify against other slaves. So, and that their word could not be taken, essentially. They were not oath-worthy. The second thing, slaves could not marry legally. So their families were treated as if they were nothing, pretty much. So if Sally Hemings didn't have a husband because she couldn't be married, there was no way to know who her children belonged to. Filius nullius. If you're born outside of wedlock, it's like you're the child of no one. So those sort of legal tropes were used to diminish. Number one, black people aren't trustworthy. Now that was, certainly these rules were formulated during slavery, but those kinds of rules roll over. The legacy of that, we see it in the criminal justice system, slave patrols, policing, all those kinds of things, they're not disconnected. You can't, black people were in slavery more centuries than we've been free. So you can't just wipe all of that stuff away. And I saw all of these things operating in this particular story. So whether it was Tom and Sally, had children or not, is interesting, but it was really how historians were writing about it and how they wrote black people out of the story. So I thought, this is my moment. All of the things that, what my parents had taught me, what I had been, the sort of bizarre hobby that I had, thinking about slavery and Monticello from the time that I was a kid through my teenage years, all of this stuff was brought to bear in the first book. My second book, The Hemings' Monticello, I received a number of awards for, but I really think my first book is better. It's better. It's more of who I am than the second book, because first place, I wrote it in secret. I didn't tell anybody except my husband that I was writing the book because I was supposed to be writing a law review article. And professors aren't supposed to be writing. Professors write books now more than they used to. But this was a legal topic, but it was much more about really the stuff that I had learned here, the things that I learned here as an associate. As I said, every single thing was brought to bear, and looking at this topic and taking all of this apart, taking apart what all the historians had said about this topic and what it said about white supremacy in the writing of history. It seems an odd thing that the people who were the objects of slavery would be not listened to, the ones who people would say, you don't know what you're talking about, that we're not going to pay attention to you. And obviously, a lot of this has to do with the fact of Jefferson because of what he meant to people. But it was a curious thing. And so I went through, well, I'm the law professor, and I'm sort of lecturing to all these historians, and you don't know what you're talking about, and blah, blah, blah. That's great, and it's wonderful, and I got a lot of acclaim for the first book. And then I was down in Charlottesville, and I was giving a talk, and somebody said, well, we're going to have an answer to this soon. And I said, okay, how's it going to happen? And they said, well, we're going to use DNA to answer this question. And so I said, oh, I thought that, that's interesting. And I didn't know until later on they hadn't figured out how they were going to do it. But somebody was willing to pay for the testing of descendants to try to see if they could answer this particular question. I don't know how you may not know about this, but the story was that the story that Jefferson's family, the legal white family, tells is the story that historians accepted, that the reason Sally Hemings' children looked just like Jefferson was that they were the children of his nephew from the Carr family, Sam Carr. So what they did was do Y chromosome testing. The men in this room, you all have a Y chromosome that was your father's, was your great-grandfather's, your great-great-grandfather's. It passes down without recombining, and it looks the same. So you can tell a line of people, a family line, a Jefferson family male line, a Hemings family male line, a Carr family male line. So what they did was, they did 3 tests. They sent them to 3 different labs in Europe, one in England, I think one in France, and one in Belgium perhaps. But DNA testing in Europe is way more sophisticated than it is here in the United States. So they sent it over there and tested them 3 different methodologies. And so it was sort of interesting. It's one thing to say this, right? And I know I was 99 9/10% sure that I was right, that it was likely that Madison Hemings, the person who claimed to be the son of Thomas Jefferson, was in fact the son of Thomas Jefferson. It's another thing to have a test. Most historians don't. Most historical controversies can't be resolved by science. So I spent a really interesting year, waiting for the jury to come back on this, and it came back, and it basically corroborated what I said. That the car, there would be a Hemings-Jefferson connection, that the car's story was crazy. And there was another family, a black family that claimed descent from Jefferson, who I said were not Jefferson descendants. And they were furious at me. I mean, some of the most acrimonious discussions, eyebrow-singeing discussions about this. But I was not going to say that it was true when I didn't think it was true. I mean, nothing in the evidence pointed to that. And sure enough, the DNA came back, and they're not connected. The point was that if you step back from passion and belief, looked at the information that was there, can't have total objectivity, but it was possible to answer this question without science. The question was answered before then. It was good to have the verification. I mean, it transformed my life, obviously. I was very happy and relieved when this happened. I got a phone call. I was cooking one evening, and I got a phone call from the Wall Street Journal, and they said, "What would you say if I told you that the DNA was back and there was a car connection?" And I said, "Oh, well, I'll say this." Well, they said, "It's not back yet, but what would you say if," and then the other one, of course, it was back. The person completely, blatantly lied. And this was like on a Tuesday, and the next day a friend of mine called to say who had found out, and he told me what the results were. And then I started getting calls from everybody from all over the world about it. And this was something I did not know, even though I had studied journalism a lot, that the story was embargoed. This was like on a Wednesday that people started calling me. It was embargoed until Sunday. Everybody was going to hold off for the Sunday paper because this was going to be a big deal. And so, I did all these interviews, and sure enough, November 1st, it was published, and then, kind of all hell broke loose on this particular thing. But I felt vindicated by that. Again, not because it was about Jefferson and Hemings, whether or not they had kids. That's interesting, and it's an important thing. And now, if you go to Monticello, you go up to the visitor center, they have a huge family tree of the Hemings family, and he's on it. That's moving the needle, and that's what I wanted to do. But the main thing was to sort of vindicate what Madison Hemings, Israel Gillette, enslaved people who had talked about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, the oral history of this family that said that they were descended from Jefferson, that it was true, that there was evidence to support it. So that was my goal. As I said, all of the things that had been happening in my life up until that point, the writing, I got to be a writer, I got to be a researcher, I got to look at a topic that I was passionate about, and I think I was able to make, I think I made a contribution to history, to the historiography, sort of changing the way people think about Jefferson, about a figure, an important figure who is quite controversial in a lot of ways, but also is sort of looms large over American history. And that started with the way my parents wanted me to think about myself. The Hemings of Monticello continues with the notion that I wanted to try to break, sort of relieve enslaved families from the grip of law or their illegality, the notion that because they were not legally legitimate, using that term, that therefore we know nothing about them, that what's going on in their lives, their connections to one another didn't make any difference. That's what I said at one point in my first book, that sort of reenacts slavery in the pages of history when you do that and you don't take their family seriously. That's what I wanted to do. And I think with the Hemings of Monticello, I talk a lot about law and legal history and the ways in which it makes us, put a circle around our families and say who is in and who is out, that there's a way around that. Law is important. Obviously, I believe that. But the kinds of human relations, the kinds of things that we're talking about in both of these books, transcended sometimes you have to look beyond it because the law is not put in place for everybody. It's not made to work for everybody. It's our hope that we can try to make it work for everybody, but the historian understands that there are moments when that just was not the case, and slavery was one of them. So I think I've had some success with that. I will continue to do that. It is something that fires my imagination. This is my life's work. And I think that what I learned here, as I said before, and what I learned working as a lawyer has helped me be a better historian. It's helped me to do a job and ask questions in ways that historians wouldn't typically, or had not up until that point when dealing with this topic, way they had not asked those questions. And that's what I learned my 1L year in this room with Alan Dershowitz and other people as my professor, and I'm eternally grateful for that. And so I'm very, very glad to be able to talk to you. So I will take any questions from you if you have any. I'm told that this is not the usual format, but...
I'll go ahead and ask a question, Professor Gordon-Reed. Thank you for your time. Can you just talk to us a little bit about some of the uncertainties that you had as a law student here at Harvard, and when you were leaving, you know, had you considered the possibility of actually becoming a writer? Had you decided that you were going to actually put it on hold? I know you mentioned saying that you would do it alongside your work as an associate, but then realized so many of us have decided to put certain aspirations on hold with the understanding that we won't actually be able to fulfill them if we want perhaps a lucrative lifestyle in the future. So maybe you could just talk to us a little bit about the vulnerabilities you had.
Well, the vulnerability is that you have student loans. And the vulnerability is that I got married at Harvard Epworth Church the day after graduation. And, you know, you start a life with somebody. You know, you're working along, and it's sort of hard to come home and say, you know what, I'm going to quit my job. First place, a person who's from California, he went to Stanford, and he came here, and he met me here, and he got married, and we were supposed to go to New York for 2 years. That was in 1984, and we're still there. So a person that I've dragged out of his paradise to New York and say, guess what, I'm going to quit my job and have, you know, less income, and I'm going to go to Columbia, where the average time for a PhD is like 7 years. If I were going to become a historian, certainly if I were going to just write, no income or very little, you know, $150 here, $200 there, it's just not practical to do. So practicality weighed in the balance. But one of the things that I think, one of the messages that I want to impart, that I think my story tells, is that it may have taken me a longer time because I had kids, and that put my late 20s, early 30s were about them, really. I worked, but most of my concentration was on them. You can do things in stages. You know, I don't think you can do things in stages. It's hard to have, if you have aspirations for, to be a lawyer. If you really, really want to do that, and you really, really want to be a writer, that's very, very hard to do. But if being a lawyer becomes onerous to you, something that you don't want to do, you can find other ways to break out, to do other things that allow you to do it. I mean, T.S. Eliot was a banker. People have had day jobs. Law is just a particularly tough one. The way it's done in New York, it's well nigh impossible for people. There's some people who can do anything, but it's very, very hard to do that and combine it with a family and combine all of this. Everything together doesn't work. It can be done in seriatim, but the key is to really try to think about what it is that you want to do, what it is that makes you feel comfortable. And it's strange. Harvard students and Yale students and Stanford students, well, I'm sort of assuming about these other places, but I'll just stick with Harvard students. I mean, you have the chances to do a lot of different things. I mean, you're not, sometimes I think we feel, I know I felt restricted. The other thing, it's not just debt. A lot of it has to do with expectations of other people. To say, oh, you've gone to this school and you've done this, then you must do something that's, commiserate with that right off the bat or whatever. You have to go and be in a channel, and you really don't have to do that. It took me a while to learn that. for the reasons that I mentioned. You know, we're not a wealthy family. I had to pay back loans. I had a husband and, you know, commitment to a particular family. But if you don't have those things, it's easier, I think, to sort of make the leap and be a writer, do other things. But I think there's time to move outside of, find a job or find something that is not as time-consuming as it's billing hours in a Wall Street firm. That's just particularly difficult for anybody doing anything.
I had a question about sort of writing against the grain, because you were sort of making a point when you were trying to offer your scholarship in sort of the history of Thomas Jefferson. A lot of historians, like other in that circle, were writing a sort of a different sort of narrative. I'm also going to bring in sort of your work on the Shield Committee and sort of your eloquent sort of dissent there, though it was like there was a lot more members in the body, and they had signed sort of majority opinions, so you had a smaller dissent, but it was an eloquent one. And I wanted to get a sense from you, sort of the challenges associated with being able to sort of have that voice, maybe that minority voice or a different voice to add to the discussion, and sort of like how you approach that sort of problem, if you think it's an issue, and what sort of, like how you get through that process in total.
Well, I mean, I got through the process. You get through the process by, if you believe that you're right, and it's, if you've done every single thing you can in searching the problem out and thinking about it, it was not about winning or losing, in a way. It's about, to me, it was about making a statement about something that I felt to be true. I thought that, I thought that the Shield, and think that the Shield could be repurposed, that the Royal Plantation is not about Isaac Royal, that it was about enslaved people, and that's what I think I've succeeded, not by myself, but I've had a hand in doing about Monticello. I don't think people, there's a big difference between going there pre-1997 and going there today. And there's a way to do it. And so since I was confident in knowing that it's done all over this country at public history sites, sites, all those kinds of things, I was confident that I was right about that. And my first book, I didn't see myself writing to, it's not like you're writing to an audience who's alive that you're trying to convince at this point. This is somewhat grandiose. You're writing to people. What if people from the future could look back and just at this and say, at my first book, and my argument there, what would they think of what I said, and what would they think of what other people said? Would there be a truth in it? Would there be something in it that would live beyond whatever the particular moment was, the particular controversy was? So a lot of it has to do with thinking the problem through, having experience, having seen this stuff done other ways, making the comparison, the analogy. This is what I said, what I learned here in law school about reasoning by analogy, taking those kinds of things together to come to a conclusion. And I'm not, afraid of being by myself on an issue if I think I'm right about it. And I wouldn't have said what I said if I didn't think I was right. It would have been, it would be easier to say, okay, let me just go along with it. Certainly, it hasn't been hard yet, but yeah, that's my personality. I think it's a matter of personality. I think even going to Anderson Elementary School, I think my personality was suited, perhaps, to that kind of experience, and others might not be, and I wouldn't be suited to be some other place. But that's how I am.
Anything you wish you had done differently, sooner, later, regrets?
I wish I'd had children earlier. They would have been the same children. But if I could have the same children, I wish I could have had them earlier. I think there's no good time, there's no perfect time to have them, but I wish I'd had them earlier. And it's a personal kind of thing. My mother died 2 months after my first child was born. So they really didn't overlap in any way. So that's if I could do something differently, and if I had the same kids, the same son and daughter, I would have had them earlier. The other stuff, I wrote the first book when I was ready to write the first book. Really, every single thing that happened to me up until that point went into that. And if any part of it was gone, I don't think it would have been the same thing. So I have no regrets about the professional stuff. Cahill, the joke about it's not a joke, it actually happened, about the person mistaking me for somebody else. That's a minor thing. I learned a lot from people there. So that's the other thing. Whatever you do, even if you look back on it and you think, man, that was a mistake, you can find something from it. Really try to pull something out of whatever it is you do. I didn't answer all of your first question about insecurities about Harvard. I will say this. Harvard is a big law school, and it can be an alienating place for lots of people. And I think it was an alienating place for me, largely because, and I think it's for all of us, this is, my husband and I say, this was sort of like your Red Star time. When we were growing up, if you had a paper, a teacher would put a gold star on it if it was really good. If it was not so good, you get a green star. And if it's not so good, you get a red star. Law school, not just at Harvard, but other places, is for many people sort of red and green star time. It's not where you can't just sort of will yourself to the top of whatever. And that's not, you've all been great, at all your lives at what you do. And that's almost any law school. People are used to being at the top, and then you come someplace, and that's hard to do. That's not easy to take. It wasn't easy to take for me, and I think it's not easy to take for other folks. And it seems unfair in a system where, if you're in college, you can start out and you're not so great, right? And you have to learn how to study. You have to learn how to do stuff. And if you're going to a graduate school or law school, they look at the transcript, they look at that, and they say, they started out here, they were okay, they got better and better and better. Great. This is inverted here, right? It's what you do first that counts. And not that the other stuff doesn't matter. Sure, but it's a testing of a particular kind of skill. It's a sort of personality that's suited to be in a big place, that knows how to, people don't mind talking out. You remember I said how I think I might have been suited for my elementary school, integrating an elementary school, whereas other people might not have been. If I were in a different kind of situation, I could. So it's the luck of a draw. So I think a lot of people perceive it as unfair, and it's tough. And I think compounding all the other kinds of issues that people have been complaining about, it's a lot to throw in there for everybody. It's just not a picnic for anyone. Maybe Yale. Everybody seems to like Yale. They don't have grades the first year, right? They don't have grades the first year. We can't do that. There are too many of us. I think this would be a very different place if you didn't have grades the first year. You just said, all right, everybody, and then everybody, it would be a level playing field. All the people who come in not intuitively understanding what you're supposed to do on the test would have time of practice. And then I think the playing field might be a bit more level. If that were done. Employers would go nuts. People would go nuts about that. But a lot of this stuff is just psychological. It isn't specifically intellectual or talent or whatever. The talent is there, but people have been wonderful lawyers. Wonderful lawyers without coming in and hitting the ball out of the park right off the bat. But that's kind of what's valued here. So I think that makes it it's a very intense place. I almost went to Yale, and my husband almost went to Yale. I came so close, I walked out to the mailbox in front of McNutt Hall at Dartmouth, and with 2 envelopes. One, and whichever I throw in, that's going to be it, because I can't decide. And so I threw it in, and I was left with the acceptance letter to Harvard, and I'd accepted Yale, and I immediately went into a panic. And I tried to get the mailboxes are hard to get into. They're impossible to get into. So I'm opening it up. I'm trying to figure out, how am I going to get this damn thing? Of course, not realizing that if I could have called up and they would, but I'm like in a panic. So the next morning, I wake up first thing and I rush down to the post office and tell them what has happened. And can you give me this envelope back? And here, and take this one. And they gave it to me, and I sent it off. So I came that close to, nirvana, right? Is that the idea for law school? But no, I'm glad I came here. I mean, again, I really do think it has had all that hardness made the tasks that I had in my 2 books easy. It told me what I had to do, the way I had to be. That hardness was something that you bring to bear on things. So it's good and it's bad. So I really wouldn't. I mean, I like the idea of going to the H and P and that over the letter grades. Not so sure about doing away with them in the first year. That would be a tough thing because it's such a large class. You could do that, I think, with a smaller group of people. But it's an alienating place. But it's definitely worthwhile, and it doesn't last forever, right?